Welcome to the Plato Paradigm, a paradigm shift in reading Plato's dialogues. Episode 141, Meno 96d to E. Socrates and Meno have just arrived at the conclusion that virtue is not something teachable because there are no teachers and no students. At least Meno seems to have agreed. He ended last time by saying it doesn't seem to be, but he carries on. Uk eoiken eper orthos hemes metha. It doesn't seem to be if indeed we have examined correctly. This looks promising from the point of view of Socrates. It seems as though Meno is beginning to wake up. He's beginning to think for himself. Let's see what he thinks is the problem. One thing we can almost be sure about is that he won't mention anamnesis, recollection, that they have already established that there is no teaching, there is only remembering the knowledge which is already inside of us. They had agreed to this story by priests and priestesses at the time, but Meno forgot it almost immediately. Hostikai thaumadzo deo Socrates poteron pote udesin agathoi andres, eitis an tropos tes geneseos ton agathon gignomenon. So that I wonder, Socrates, whether there are good men at all, and what would be the way of coming about, of good people coming about. The first coming about is the noun genesis, the origin, and the second coming about is the participle describing the good men coming to be good men. Both the noun and the participle come from the same root. Meno raises 2 points. The first one is whether there are good men at all. The second question is, if there are good men, how do they come about? It seems that removing teachers and students for Meno poses a great problem. It reduces the possibilities of there being good people at all. He doesn't seem to ask himself why teachers of all people would make other people good. Are the teachers themselves good? He doesn't ask that question. Although he does treat Gorgias as a wise person, a good person, although even he knows that Gorgias himself believes that virtue is not something teachable. The first time Meno had asked about virtue at the beginning of the dialogue, he had given 4 options that virtue might be something teachable, something exercisable, something which comes to people by nature, or some other way. When Meno later tried to avoid answering yet again what virtue was, he said he would rather return to his original question. They immediately began with only 3 of the options. They had already dropped the option that virtue is something exercisable. Since then, Socrates has been treating the first option, that virtue is something teachable, as a hypothesis. Let's suppose that virtue is something teachable. Let's examine that. And for the rest of the dialogue until now, this is what they've been looking at. Socrates chose to treat this option by showing that people who have virtue naturally would be locked up in a tower during their childhood, so that they would be valuable adults for the polis once they had grown up. And Meno himself could see that this was a ridiculous idea. So the options had been reduced from 4 to 1. And now even that one option has been removed. In fact, 2 of the options haven't been considered, one being the idea that virtue is something exercisable, and the other that there's some other option we don't know about. We've already had that option, which is anamnesis, recollection, but as I say, Meno has forgotten all about that. As for exercising, this is something Socrates is doing all the time. He is trying to engage Meno's mind by puzzling it, irritating it, to wake it up from its slumbers. This is the very first stage in dialectic exercise. All of the dialogue is a dialectic exercise. Socrates isn't going to return to things which haven't worked, such as talking about anamnesis or looking at teaching, which he has already looked at from a variety of aspects, including the exercise with the slave, which Meno didn't recognize at all as teaching. Socrates will have to come up with something new, and to mark this new stage in the dialogue, Plato has Socrates give us a sort of bridge between the passage about teaching and the next subject. Formally, it will be an answer to Meno's last question, how good people come about. Kindoniumen o menon egoticae su fao loitines enaiandres, cae sete gorgias hikonos pepaidiukenae cae me prodikos. We happen to be, Meno, I and you, some worthless men, and Gorgias seems not to have taught you sufficiently well, nor Prodicus me. The verb for teaching here is not the usual one, it's not didasko, it's paiduo, which we could distinguish from didasko by translating it as educate rather than teach. Socrates may have used this verb instead of the usual one because Meno and Socrates have just agreed that there are no teachers, therefore the teachers cannot teach because there are no teachers, but at the same time there are teachers. Gorgias and Prodicus are both sophists, they do teach, but Socrates can't use the verb didasko, at least he pretends not to be able to because he uses paiduo instead. Did Gorgias educate Meno at all directly? At the beginning of the dialogue we heard that his friend, his lover, Aristippus, studied with Gorgias, and we are led to assume that Meno knows what he knows from Gorgias through Aristippus. As for Prodicus teaching Socrates anything, there is an account that Socrates paid for the cheapest course possible, and Prodicus was particularly known for his distinction between words, to the point of pedantry. To say that these two sophists taught Meno and Socrates anything directly is questionable, but Socrates must have mentioned both of them here just to point out to Meno that even if there are no teachers, the teachers exist. They teach something, but not virtue, and therefore whatever they teach their students cannot be good, because if they're good after being taught, they would have learnt arete, virtue. So Socrates concludes that they must be worthless men, having been educated insufficiently by these sophists. This should have got a reaction from Meno because it isn't nice for Meno to hear that he is worthless. Meno doesn't react because Socrates carries on talking. Pantos malon un prosecteon ton nun he minautois, cae zeteteon hostis hemas henigeto tropo beltius poiese. More than anything, then, we should pay attention to ourselves, and we should search who will make us better in at least one way. Who could make them better, that is, who could give them virtue, if there are no teachers of virtue. The only obvious candidate would be someone like the person in Theognis who teaches himself by looking at other people, or anything else really. In other words, Socrates is hinting, so I see it, that they should be looking for themselves. They are the ones who can make themselves better. Nobody else can. This isn't what Socrates goes on to say, but it does seem to be the obvious answer to the question, who will make us better? Since no teacher can make them better, who else is there? By the way, I'm not saying that there are no teachers of virtue, but I'm just following the logic of the argument here. Although he just asked, who will make us better, Socrates now goes on to imply that we should be looking for something which makes us better. Lego de tauta apoplepsas prosten artisetesin, hos hemas elethen kategelastos, hoti monon epistemes hegumenes, orthos tekaiu tois anthropois pratetai tau pragmata, hei issos kai diafuge hemas tognonai, tina potetropon gignontai hoi agathoiandres. I say these things looking at our examination just now, that it ridiculously escaped our attention that affairs are done by humans correctly and well, not only when episteme is guiding. And here perhaps also escapes us knowing in what way at all good men come to be. By mentioning episteme as guiding the deeds of people and thereby making their deeds correct and good, Socrates is returning to the argument following the hypothesis that if virtue is something teachable, then it must be episteme. However, it wasn't episteme which, by guiding, made actions good and correct, but phronesis, the activity of lungs, the highest virtue, or one of the four cardinal virtues. As usual, Socrates misremembers in order to test his interlocutor, and as usual, Meno doesn't react.